Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm an undergraduate fellow at the Center for Ethics, and I would love to welcome Mr. Bob Ray to the center today.
Hi, Jenny.
Mr. Ray, you graduated from University College in the University of Toronto, and you are back today after a notable career in Canadian politics, public service, law, teaching, and Aboriginal rights advocacy. So thank you for coming.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your service to Canada.
It was a pleasure.
So 2 years ago, I attended a Vic 1 plenary at Victoria College where you spoke about leadership, and it was great to revisit your talk on leadership in your book, What's Happened to Politics. And in your book, you say effective leadership requires vision, persuasion, and implementation. My question for you, though, is where do you think ethics falls into place for effective leadership in your experience?
Well, I think in all three areas, because the vision is always, should be rooted in values of some kind. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about people who were very effective leaders, but they may have a very flawed vision, which may be based on their own personal aggrandizement or something even more horrible or worse. I mean, if you look at the history of the 20th century, it's full of significant leaders, many of whom have been totally had values that are impossible to agree with. Mm-hmm. And also whose methods of persuasion and whose methods of implementation were brutal. Mm-hmm. So the value stream runs through the whole piece. The value is there in the vision. The value is there in how you persuade, what methods and techniques you use to persuade, mm-hmm.
And
how you implement and do what you say you're going to do. So, the simple test, does the end justify the means? No, it doesn't. If the means are rotten, it destroys the end which you're seeking to achieve. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge value normative component in good leadership, and we can admire at a certain level the effectiveness or the brazenness of a certain technique of demonstrating your leadership. But we can also say, but it's founded on something that's profoundly unethical, so there's a problem. And I think that's where I see the importance of ethics, the importance of being clear and transparent in what your normative system or system of values that lies behind what you're doing, what that really is.
Yeah, because you say leadership really starts with the self.
Yes.
So it's evident that it would come up in every part of what makes effective
When you look
leadership.
at yourself in the mirror, can you say that your vision has integrity? Can you say that you have integrity? And can you say that what you're trying to do and the way you're trying to implement it has integrity? And all those elements are critically important. But what's also important is effectiveness. How effective is your leadership? And sometimes we don't associate that the test of pragmatism. How practical is what you're suggesting, and how much does it connect to getting things done? But there is, in fact, a clear relationship in terms of effectiveness that you have to think about. Are we doing what we said we would do?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And another talk you're going to be giving today is about Indigenous peoples and resource development. It's an event sponsored by the Center for Ethics, the Monk School of Global Affairs, and the Ethics, Society and Law program at Trinity College. So, throughout your career, you have been strongly committed to advancing Aboriginal rights and the reconciliation of Aboriginal peoples with the rest of Canada. For example, your participation in the Tamagi Wilderness Society's Red Squirrel Road blockade in 1989.
Well, you've done your homework.
Yeah, a bit of a interesting bit of a rest there.
Yes.
But it worked out.
Yeah?
Yeah, but today you're still continuing your work in this field. You are acting as an advisor for the Matawa First Nations, a tribal council that contains 9-member Ojibwe and Cree First Nations in the Ring of Fire discussions with the government of Ontario. And if I may, I'm going to give a bit of a brief history about the Matawa First Nations, and in particular Treaty 9, also known as the James Bay Treaty.
Yeah, sure.
So Treaty 9 was one of the largest numbered treaties to be signed in Canada, and to my knowledge it was the only treaty in Canada to be signed by a province. So it's very significant, and it was first signed in 1905, so over 100 years ago. What could its relevance be today? Except it is quite relevant, as I'm going to get to. So the negotiations with Treaty 9 were substandard, to say the least, and you say in your book the Aboriginal peoples couldn't speak English, they couldn't even read what they were signing, and that they were asked to put their hands on the top of pens as a government official signed an X for them. So today, Treaty 9 still governs over 40,000 Aboriginal peoples, including the Matawa First Nations, and there's still very little agreement between the treaty partners about what that treaty says. And this polarized understanding of the treaties has significant impact in relations between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown, especially for land and resource development like the Ring of Fire. So given these difficult relations between Indigenous peoples and the state, it's generated significant leadership challenges in Canada. So what does our current leadership need to do to substantially improve these relationships going forward?
Well, it's a huge topic, and you've described it very well. I mean, the trouble with the treaties generally is that people need to understand that the parties to the treaty have a very different understanding of their relationship, a very different understanding of what happened, and a very different interpretation, therefore, of what the treaty is. For the Crown and for governments and for most Canadians, a treaty is a document. And the document either says or doesn't say certain things. And the document is about rights and what do you get and what don't you get and what do you do and what don't you do. And it's all set out in the document. That's what the treaty is. The treaty is a written contract. It has a greater significance than a contract because the very word treaty implies an agreement between peoples or between states. We don't talk about a treaty between General Motors and the United Auto Workers. We talk about a collective bargaining agreement. We talk about a contract between General Motors and another auto company. We don't talk about that as a treaty. We do talk about these documents in Canadian life as treaties. But the trouble with the treaties is that the First Nations people have a very different view of the relationship. Their view is based on what were all of the discussions that took place surrounding the treaty, the signing of the treaty. Were there any discussions? Were there other understandings which the First Nations people had and asserted in the course of the conversations between the government and the First Nations? And those inevitably involve a view that, well, this is our land. We recognize that you are here and you are using the land and you want to share it with us. That's okay, but we insist that we maintain our relationship with the land and that we are stewards of the land and that we are the keepers of this land. And this land is, to coin a phrase, this land is our land. You can share it with us, but we're not giving it to you, and we're not ceding it to you, and we're not giving it up for all time. What a crown, what the Canadian government, what the British government traditionally wanted was legal certainty. They wanted to be able to say, we got to know if we're going to point X on the map, who owns that land? Is that Crown land or is that some other kind of land? And so in the view of the Crown, all of Northern Ontario is Crown land, except for, well, even including the reservations where Indian people live, and the government says, yeah, you're living on the Crown land, but we'll give it to you, and you can stay there, and that's your little strip of land. Stay there, and you can run that one. And then we have the Indian Act, which says how you're supposed to run it. But for the rest, you can have some traditional use of the land, but the land still belongs to the Crown. And this view is not what First Nations think they signed up for. And their fundamental argument is, why would we receive $5 a year and whatever else we get from the government? Why would we possibly give up everything, give up all the land which has been ours, and say, here, you take it over? And so this all goes back to the doctrine of discovery and the ideas that justified European settlement in the first place. What were the Europeans thinking when they came to the Americas? What did they assume? Well, they assumed that the people living there were savages. They assumed that they were not Christians. They were not civilized, quote, civilized people. And they had the authority of the Pope and the authority of the British Crown and everybody who gave a charter to a company to go across the ocean and see what you can find and bring it all back. And in the case of Canada, there was a battle between two empires, between the French and the British, and off they go. So you really have to think carefully about, where are we today? Our Canadian leaders who have the majority, I mean, the only difference between Canada and South Africa is numbers. In South Africa, the settlers were never a majority. And eventually, after 1989, 1990, they had to accede to the reality that the black majority and colored majority, and they're all the people together, we're going to have to be given rights, and we're going to have to be allowed to participate fully in the life of the government. And that would mean that you would have an indigenous majority, indigenous people. Well, Canada doesn't have an indigenous majority. We have an indigenous minority. We have a relatively small number of people compared to the broad population. And so all the way through this piece, we need to be thinking through to say, well, we have some court decisions which are moving us in a certain direction. Where is the policy going? Where is the political leadership of the country headed when it comes to resolving these questions? And that's where we need to know what people's vision is. What's your vision? What's your vision of reconciliation? What's your vision for the future? And if it's simply to say, well, we're here because we're here because we're here, and we have a majority, and we're not going to do very much apart from the treaties. The treaties are there. They signed them. We signed them. You signed them. They're there. That's the end of the relationship. And I don't believe that's a tenable position. I don't think it's morally tenable. And I don't even think it's legally tenable. But, I may or may not be right about that. But I certainly feel that from a political, moral point of view, it's not tenable. That what needs to happen is that there needs to be an understanding between First Nations people and non-Aboriginal people about how we're going to share this land. And it can't be simply based on the majority rules. It has to be based on the premise that there was something unique in the relationship that stems from who got here first and whose land was it in terms of how it's going to be shared and how it's going to be dealt with. And the second thing is, we do have to have some human understanding, some sense of compassion that the principle of the dignity of every person applies. And that, I think, is where majorities can abuse their power if they don't recognize the difference of the other, if they don't recognize that the people who we have abused and thought ourselves superior to are in fact people just like us. They have feelings, and they have experiences, and they have values, and they have issues that we have to listen to. And it requires a certain kind of listening to get to a better place.
Absolutely. So even after the Calder decision, there's still a lot of work to be done. Despite the modern treaties that have arisen, there's still a lot of work to be done. And thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
I look forward to attending the Public Issue Forum.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I really enjoyed it.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.